and welcome to our second episode of the PreService Teacher Pals Podcast, brought to you by UTS EdSoc, where we talk all about things education with some of our teaching pals. We're your hosts, Adelaide and Ning, and today we are joined by the tech whiz himself, Kieth Heggart.
Kieth is an early career researcher and currently a lecturer in learning design at the University of Technology, Sydney. He has done some extensive research in learning design and is an expert in all things technology. With over 15 years of high school teaching experience, he has taught in several countries. He has a passion for civics and citizenship education as well as technologically enhanced learning. He has got a lot of advice to give on all things education.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Kieth. How are you? How's lockdown treating you?
Hello, and thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here on the podcast. Yeah, so I'm coming to you from Darragland, which is Penrith, and lockdown is okay at the moment. We've just finished the first week of online learning with my children, and we've survived. So yeah, we'll just see how we go.
That's awesome. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm relatively new to the higher education space. I was a teacher for 15 years, and I kind of fell into teaching after a couple of other things. I think I started doing an engineering degree, which was okay, but it didn't really light my fire. And then I moved across into an arts degree. But you know, the joke when I was going through university was that no arts degree, no one ever gets a job with it, just an arts degree. So I tacked on education at the end. And then I remember when I did my very first prac, which was at Randwick Boys High School, my first professional experience, suddenly something just really clicked. And I thought, you know what, I actually quite enjoy this. I enjoy talking to people about books, about writing, about reading. I like seeing them get excited about history, and yeah, the rest, as they say, is history. So I finished my education degree, and the thing that really excited me about an education degree, much more so than some other kinds of qualifications that you can get, is that it's a degree that you can travel with. So when I finished my Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Education, I applied to teach overseas and I was accepted. And so, you know, within the space of 4 months of graduation, I was teaching in a little Thameside village called Chafford 100 at a brand new school. And I was a junior teacher in a school full of junior teachers because it was literally brand new. We had just year 7. And I think there was about 6 teachers plus the principal and about 130 children. And they were building the campus around us. And I guess that is where my interest in what I call technology-enhanced learning really got started, because Chafford 100 Campus, as it was called then, it's changed its name now, had a claim that it was trying to be a school for the future, not a school of the future, but a school for the future. And it saw technology being really, really crucial in that respect. And so it blew my mind. And remember, this is early 2000s, okay? I think we're talking about 2002, 2003 here. Every child had a laptop, as part of their enrollment. You know, they were all given a laptop, and all of their lockers had chargers inbuilt, so that when they weren't using their laptop, they could plug or they could plug it in their locker and leave it there. So it was always charged. It was incredible.
Wow, that's better than any setup I've seen in any schools today.
Yeah. It was certainly a really innovative place to work. And the other thing that fascinated me about it was we didn't teach separate subjects. We taught an integrated curriculum. So, for example, in year 7, we would teach topics. And so, you know, we might teach a topic for a week that was called myths and histories or something like that. But throughout it all, we would touch on curriculum elements from history, from geography, from science, from maths. And so, you know, me, the English history high school teacher, suddenly had to develop these pedagogies, this subject knowledge across all these different areas. So the learning curve was pretty steep.
They suddenly threw you in the deep end in your first year of teaching, which is quite funny. And it's so cool that was your experience as a graduate teacher. And going back a bit, what was your experience as a pre-service teacher on your placements and pracs?
It was interesting because I didn't actually go into a school until about the third or maybe even the fourth year of my degree. And that really made me feel a little bit nervous because I was wondering, what happens if I'm no good at this? You know, like, luckily for me at Randall Boys, it all kind of fell into place. But I know that there were, fellow classmates who had a pretty ordinary first experience, and then they just left the career. You know, they said, you know what, my first professional experience, it's come so late in my degree. I'm really disappointed that it's taken 3 or even 4 years for me to find out that I don't really want to be a teacher.
Yeah, that's why we're so lucky at UTS that we go on placement 3 weeks into our course so that we're able to know if we like it or not.
It's one of the best things that I've heard, Yeah, I mean, we all know that you learn the most about teaching by actually doing the teaching. Now, you've got to do all of the theory. You've got to be able to talk about it. You've got to be able to reflect about it. You've got to learn about the curriculum and you've got to learn how to teach it. But you really learn it when you have to do it. And I think the more practical experience, supported practical experience, the better. I did another professional experience at King Coppell Rose Bay School of the Sacred Heart. So that was an incredible experience because I did a whole term there. That's the way they structured it at my university. And I was automatically, because I was the most junior teacher in the school, I was placed in the worst classroom in the school. And even in the worst classroom in the school, I still had a view of the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House out of the window. It was just extraordinary. I mean, the school itself has its own ferry stop for all the students who come off there. That really opened my eyes to, the glaring inequalities that you see in schools. So from there, I went and I did another professional experience in a school in Western Sydney. And that was, let's just say there were no views of the Opera House from my classroom window there.
Well, that's really good. On the topic of pre-service teachers then, would you have any interview top tips based on your experience?
Yeah. When I left teaching, I didn't go straight into higher education. I went and worked for one of the big teaching unions for about 5 years, and I did a lot of work with pre-service teachers. And one of the things that I would always talk to them about is, how do you get your first job? And it's often not a matter of what you do in the interview. So that's my first tip. It's not really about the interview. It's about everything that you've done before. So when I was leader of learning, like in charge of teaching and learning at a school in Western Sydney, we would get heaps and heaps of people applying to be casual teachers. And we would see casual teachers, especially young casual teachers, as almost trial runs to see if we wanted to give them a shot at a job. So my first tip is, if you're working in a school as a casual teacher, see it as a job interview. So that means arrive early, not on time, early. Be organized, be prepared. And when I say be prepared, absolutely expect the person who's meant to be giving your work to be snowed under, or maybe to be sick themselves, or to not be ready. And so have some backup activities that you can just go like that and make it happen in the classroom. And the other piece of advice I always give is, no matter how bad your day is, always have a good day. So at the end of the day, you say, thank you for inviting me. I had a great day with year 4 or with, year 8 English. And I really hope that you invite me back. Teachers and schools thrive on a positive attitude. Then when you get into the interview, if you're a bloke, you've got to wear a suit and tie. Go in there prepared to talk about things that you've done. So they will ask you, tell us about a lesson that you've taught, and how did it go? And then they'll try to give you the really tricky question: how do you know that the students learned that? So have an answer prepared for that. So be comfortable talking about your pedagogy, your particular approaches, and how that actually manifests itself in the classroom. Be prepared to talk about your behavior management strategies and how they work. So there's always 2 or 3 that you should be able to draw on. More effective than the grumpy teacher face that we all develop over time. So those kinds of things. And the most important thing is, be enthusiastic. show that you want the job, show that you're going to bring something to the school more than just a warm body in the classroom, okay? You're going to bring your passion for teaching, but your passion for the subject areas that you're going to teach as well, your enthusiasm, and you know, this kind of warm, human, personal nature. You know, that's what students respond to, that's what parents respond to, and that's what gets you jobs. Yeah. Oh, and don't lie in the interview. Sometimes they'll ask you questions, and you know, I remember when I went for my graduate, the targeted teacher program, you know, and they were asking me all these questions about what else would I do. I said, oh, yes, I'd be absolutely willing to coach a soccer team or a football team or a basketball team. And then they said, oh, you know, would you be interested in you know, assisting with the school musical or things like that? And I'm like, and I was going to say yes, and then I'm like, oh, come on, Kieth, you can't sing to save your life. And I was like, no. There are things I can do and there are things I can't do, and that is one thing that I would not inflict on anybody. Yeah, so be honest about your capabilities.
Those are some great tips. Thank you so much for sharing them. I will definitely be taking them on board myself when starting casual teaching. And so obviously you were a high school teacher for 15 years. What was your experience transitioning into a tertiary role, and the difference between being a tertiary educator and a secondary educator, and what role do you prefer?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I actually think I enjoy the tertiary education more. Though even as I say that, I'm not sure I do. All right. I'm going to answer this again differently. There are so many more opportunities in school education. You will do all kinds of incredible things as part of your work as a teacher, and I just think that's brilliant. So let me give you an example. You know, when I was teaching in the UK, you know, I travelled all over Europe as part of the, you know, my work as a teacher. I went to Spain, I went to France, I went to Germany, you know, as well as all over the England and the rest of the UK. And that was just what you did as part of your role. And sure, you're there in a supervisory capacity and you've got responsibilities, but gee, it's still a lot of fun, you know. Those kind of opportunities don't exist in the tertiary sector. But in the tertiary sector, you do have a lot more freedom. And certainly the workload is a lot less in terms of teaching. Yeah, I don't know. I quite enjoy both of them.
All right, let's talk a bit about technology and education, your expertise. So you taught throughout the early 2000s. So I'm interested to know, what were the difference in technologies you found from early 2000s to current teaching?
Yeah, it's been like such an exciting time to be involved in education and to see all of this kind of thing developing over time. So like I said, when I first started teaching at the school in the UK, we had these big chunky laptops that the batteries only lasted for an hour. And then even over the 5 years that I was there, we moved away from laptops to what were these early versions of tablets, and we called them portable digital assistants. And you know, some people might remember Palm Pilots and Blackberries. They were kind of like that. And they were seen as being, you know, the next wave in schools. And I have to be honest, so this was about 2006, 2007. We just didn't really get the hang of it. And I think that was partly because we didn't really understand the capabilities. I mean, because it was new for everybody, right? But equally, I think the big thing that has changed is that there are whole communities out there now that support teachers to make use of these tools effectively. And they develop resources and they provide guides. And there are a lot more tools that are designed specifically for educational purposes. And when I say tools, I mean everything from hardware to software. You know, and that didn't exist back in 2006, 2007. And then when I returned to Australia, I went to a school in Stanhope Gardens, which is in northwest parts of Sydney. And I was teaching there in another school that had just provided Apple laptops for all of their students and was teaching another version of this integrated curriculum. And just the difference between, you know, those couple of years, what I saw was a real emphasis on combining pedagogy effectively with the technology. So I guess a good way of thinking about it is the conversation changed from, we've got a laptop, what can we do with it, to, we want to improve learning. How can the laptop help us do that? And ultimately, it's not really about the laptop. It's about, you know, the materials, the resources, the things that you can access via the laptop. And then from there, you know, all the way until I finished teaching, which was in about 2015, I think. It just seemed to gain pace. And what I really saw, and I have mixed feelings about this, but I think there are some good points about it, was that a lot of the educational technology, or a lot of the technology companies really became interested in educational technology and supporting teachers. Now, obviously, they do that to sell products. Let's be honest about it. We know how this works. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't some fantastic tools and resources out there. So I became an Apple Distinguished Educator in 2009. And that was on the back of a project that I did with some other teachers where we developed interactive storybooks using iMovie and these hand-drawn storybooks. And I think that we did that with year 8. And then we went and we took them across to the primary school across the road and you know, read these interactive storybooks with sound effects and hand-drawn images to these year 4, year 5 students. It was just the most wonderful experience. And then in 2011, I became a Google certified teacher. And that was when Google really started to focus on how they could support teachers and the development of Google, or Google Docs and Google Drive and Google Classroom. And the big thing about me, at this point, I was working a lot with students who were struggling with literacy, was this notion of collaborative co-editing. Now, you used to do that when you would have a student sitting next to you at the teacher's desk and you would help them write the next sentence. But with things like Google Docs, suddenly I could do that with 25 students all at the same time. And I'd jump in and out of their documents and help them construct their narratives or their stories or their procedural descriptions all at the same time. And that just blew my mind. And we're talking, what, 2011, 2012 here. The next thing that I guess I was fortunate enough to do was go to a lot of the Apple Educator Institute. So we had some in Bali, we had some in San Diego, and some in Cork in Ireland. And what I found, you know, a lot of teaching is about finding your tribe, you know, your like-minded educators. And if you fall into a school full of like-minded educators, you're in an incredibly lucky place. And you know, the Apple Distinguished Educators was my tribe. These were people who were keen to really, you know, blow the doors off schools and open them up to the whole world and say, you know, what can we really, really do with technology to make learning so much more powerful than, you know, let's read this and write this down. And I'm not saying that's what it was in the past, but, you know, it was about doing more than we already were. Yeah. And now, you know, every school you go into is a BYOD school. Most of the schools have incredible resources available to them. Yeah. So I think it's a pretty exciting time to be an educator. It's tough. I'm not going to say it's not, but it's also exciting. Yeah.
The more you talk, the more crazy your career sounds, of just all these countries you've been able to visit. It's just amazing. And so on, you know, being on a global level, obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic and all in lockdown. What are your thoughts on remote learning?
The first thing that I want to say is that this notion of remote learning is not unknown. It's not entirely unheard of. Australian educators have been teaching remotely. I mean, you look at the School of the Air, which has started off using radios and now uses the internet and satellite connections. You know, teachers have been teaching remotely for 50, 60 years. So the skill set exists, and there's lots that we already know about how to effectively teach. But the problem is that it's a skill set that's quite distant for your average classroom teacher, you know, who's used to teaching in a face-to-face environment. And then coupled with that, the other thing that I'd say is that you just have to be filled with admiration for teachers across Australia who, without a word of complaint, have given up their holidays to prepare for online learning, have pivoted so quickly across to these new forms that they weren't entirely confident with, most of them, and have somehow tried to make it work. And I just think, whatever teachers are being paid, the government, their employers, just needs to double it. Maybe only for last year and this year, but just double it, because they're worth every cent of it. And then what I would really like to see happen in the future is that we take the things that we've learned from online learning and we incorporate them in our face-to-face practice. But what I mean by that is our new facility, our new skills with Zooms means that we can provide a more equitable approach to education, but also a much more diverse approach to education. So why shouldn't we encourage more and more people to come virtually into our classroom? So rather than hearing me talk about, the Romeo and Juliet, why can't we get a filmmaker who's made a film about Romeo and Juliet Skyping in from Los Angeles, or not Skyping, Zooming, I guess, but you know what I mean. So that kind of capacity that we've kind of discovered during the COVID pandemic, I think it'd be a shame not to incorporate.
Those are some excellent points that you've made on remote teaching. I think it's really important that we do continue to use our skills in technology that we've learned through remote learning in our own face-to-face teaching practice. And so you have done a lot of research and work around learning design. Can you tell us what learning design is and how it can help teachers?
Great question. Yeah. And obviously this is an area that I feel quite heavily invested in, because, that's my role, lecturer in learning design. And the first thing I'll say is that in Australia, it doesn't seem to have much status at the moment, though it is changing. That idea is changing really, really rapidly. It is a growing field in Australia and overseas. What I mean when I talk about learning design is the way that we prepare, the way that we design, develop, implement, and evaluate learning experiences for students. And you might think, well, hang on, that's what I do as a teacher. And of course you do, but I think learning design is a much broader field, because it takes into account, what we do at university as well, but it also takes into account corporate settings. It can include non-formal training settings, and more than just your traditional classroom and online classroom environments, so things like your aid memoirs, your how-to manuals, your technical writing, that all falls within what I would consider to be learning design. And it's quite a big field in Europe, and in the US it's often linked to instructional design, and the terms are often used interchangeably. But what I really like about it, especially what I like about it for teachers, is that it is very clear about how you should go about constructing and sequencing instruction in order to ensure that your learners have learnt what's expected of them, which I think is something that is often overlooked, and that sounds ridiculous, right? But it's often overlooked in tertiary education. So for example, something that learning designers spend a great deal of time talking about is, how do you develop a meaningful learning objective? What does that actually look like? And whenever I talk about this to teachers, they're like, wow, there's so much to take into account. Nobody ever taught me how to write a decent learning objective. And I'm like, I know, but this is what you're meant to be doing. And then the other thing that learning design does really well is the other end of the kind of spectrum. How do you measure, how do you assess, how do you evaluate that your students have met that learning objective? And what does that assessment and evaluation actually look like? And again, despite being a core skill, I think that's often overlooked. So I work a lot with teachers, and I did this when I was, head of teaching and learning at a couple of different schools, and we would talk about the feedback that teachers would give. And I remember sitting with a very good head of English, and she would write on students' papers, things like, this was a very good essay, but I think to get a better mark, you need to write more. I'm like, that's not great feedback,
Yeah.
I mean, it could be great feedback, but as it stands, writing more is going to get you a better mark. That's not how the HSC is marked or anything else. More about what? So providing learners with helpful, meaningful feedback is central to, I think, what is learning design. And of course, the really exciting part about this, and this is where the technology aspects come into, is that in some cases, you don't need to be the one giving that feedback. Technology assists us in providing semi-automated or even fully automated feedback about students' performance. So if we look at the way learning management systems might be used to, and this is a little bit scary, gather data about students' interactions and their understanding, then what we can do is use tools to craft, firstly, to model their learning, to understand how they're learning. And then we can use tools to provide them with advice on how to further that learning. So it almost becomes a closed feedback loop where the teacher isn't involved. Now, I don't condone that. I think that's a really bad idea. I think the teacher always needs to be involved, but certainly if it can take a lot of the administration work out of it, that's good for teachers. So I think those kind of areas of learning design have real implications for teachers.
That's really cool what you said about that technology, how it is being used. Is it being used in classrooms now?
Yep. So the one that I'm talking about there about providing automated feedback is there's 3 or 4 universities in a consortium. It's called On Task. It's currently in I guess you'd call it in beta. But I actually used it on my students in the Grad Cert Learning Design, which is a course that I teach at UTS. They were all getting automated feedback depending on how they were going in the course. And they thought it was from me. They responded as if it was from me because it sounded so human, so natural. And I think that's a really good sign. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So Kieth, how can teachers use technology to enhance their learning and teaching practice?
Yeah, so there's lots of different frameworks out there about how technology can enhance, can do exactly what you're talking about there. And probably the one that gets the most attention is Ruben Puntedera's SAMR framework. So Ruben Puntedera talks about technology either substituting, augmenting, modifying, or redefining learning. So substitution is basically, technology does exactly the same thing as pen and paper, except you just do it on a computer. So instead of writing an essay, you write on paper, you write an essay on Word, and that's not a fantastic use of the technology. But other models that I think are probably of more value are things like the high possibility classrooms model. So that's by a scholar from UTS called Jane Hunter. And she's done a lot of work, especially in primary schools, about the effective use of technology and leading into STEM and STEAM education. And she's come up with a whole list of different qualities related to high possibilities. And I think that even the name gives you an idea of how technology can enhance our learning. It can provide these possibilities, provided that teachers and students are capable of grasping those possibilities that didn't exist before. So that instantaneous personalized feedback couldn't happen before, but it can through technology. That curated pathway through course materials and curricula couldn't happen before. It can happen now. Adaptive testing, so that students get the exact kind of support that they need, are all examples of that kind of things. And then related to that, and I think this is the crucial point about how technology can enhance learning, is that you often hear the argument that, we have to have pedagogy before technology. I would suggest that that was a good argument maybe 5 years ago. Now we need to talk about technology enhanced learning, or how we can blend the tools that technology provides us with what we want the students to actually learn. So it needs to be a holistic conversation, not a conversation about pedagogy with technology bolted onto the side. And of course, it absolutely should not be a conversation about the technology first, and then the pedagogy gets bolted onto the side either. And the framework that I think is most useful for that is the TPAC framework, which is the Technological, Pedagogical and Content Knowledge framework by Mishler and Coleman, I think.
Wow, that's really interesting. And sort of stemming off technology in the classroom, obviously there are quite a few issues when it comes to the ethics of using technology within a classroom. Do you have anything to share about that?
Yeah, I think this is a very significant issue, especially in Australia at the moment, and especially as more and more technology moves into these spaces that are ripe for data analysis. You hear a lot about learning analytics at the moment, which I think is a really exciting field of study. But learning analytics is predicated upon needing to gather this information from a range of different sources based on the interactions that students have with particular learning management systems. So automatically it assumes that all learning takes place within the learning management system, where I don't think that's always the case. That learning takes place in a lot of different ways, and also I worry about students becoming trapped in one particular ecosystem where all of their learning fits within, for example, Apple. So all of their books live in Apple Books, and they use Apple proprietary software. So I do worry about that kind of siloing of the student experience. I think the students need to be encouraged to try lots and lots of different kinds of tools. And then, of course, the reality is that the educational technology market is flooded with lots and lots of different companies and startups who all make, promises about what their products can and can't do. But they are often very, very cagey about how they intend to use the data that they collect. So they will sometimes be a little bit less than honest about how they on-sell that data. Now, the good news is that there are movements to change that. So in Europe, there have been huge changes about how different companies and organizations have got to comply with data ethics. In the US, there's a similar move, and I understand that there are similar requirements coming into place in Australia. So it's very much a watch this space kind of conversation.
That's really interesting. Here's a really a speculative question, but do you think teachers will be replaced by robots one day?
Haven't they already? And yeah, I think I remember when I was growing up and we'd go to the library. They used to have these books called Beyond 2000 or something like that, right? And they were going to be flying cars, and we were all going to be holidaying on the moon by 2000, and teachers were going to be out of a job by the year 2000. Now we're already at 2021. It hasn't happened, right? It's failed miserably, and I think that's true because people like to talk to people for the most part. People like to learn. That's the crucial bit, from other people. Not entirely, not all the time, and not in isolation. But when you're wrestling with something that's hard, it's nice to be able to say, hey, can you explain that to me again? Or can you show me another way of doing that? Or have I got this right? Or can we talk about, that kind of thing is just fundamental to human nature. And I can't see that ever being replaced. But, so while I don't think the robot as teacher is ever going to happen, I think the robot as augmenting the teacher is a real exciting idea, potentially a really good thing. So if I can have a robotic assistant, and we're really talking about software, right? That can answer the questions that seem to come up all the time about deadlines or about due dates or about how many words, that would be brilliant. If I've got something that can identify which students are at risk of failing, year 4, year 3, professional experience 5, that's brilliant. I absolutely want to make use of that. So I don't think teachers are ever going to be replaced by robots, but I think their work can be augmented by doing the really boring administrative stuff and maybe some of the analysis stuff, which allows the teachers to spend more time doing the human stuff, the stuff where the real skill of teaching is.
I really like your outlook on augmenting teachers. There's just so much admin work, so it'd be great if robots or computers could take over. And so we want to talk a bit about your passion in civics and citizenship education. How can we as teachers promote that into our classrooms and to our students?
Yeah, this is where I get really fired up, because the Melbourne Declaration and the Alice Springs Mafaltway Declaration make it really, really clear that there are only a couple of fundamental goals for schooling. So these are the pinnacle documents that every educator should be familiar with. Now, I know they're not, and that's part of the problem, but they should be. And what they talk about is one of the goals is for young people in Australia to be active and informed citizens or members of the community. And I actually like the phrasing members of the community, because when you go into a classroom and you're teaching people, not every student in your classroom will be a citizen of Australia. Now, I think they'll actually be, global citizens, whatever that means. But in a socio-political sense, it can be a little bit fuzzy. And that's why I think, members of the community is better, because regardless of our citizenship status, we can all be members of the community. But if this is a fundamental goal of Australian schooling, I always get really depressed, because it is very rarely expressed in schooling. I'll give you some examples of where it's done and how it's done really, really badly. So for example, lots of schools will have talks about digital citizenship. And digital citizenship talks will generally be delivered by the local police or maybe a cyber safety expert. And they will basically resolve down to: don't give out your address online, don't tell anyone your password, don't post selfies where you're not wearing any clothes, that kind of stuff, okay? Now, all of that is good advice, and I'm not saying you should do that, but that's not digital citizenship. That's digital safety, okay? Citizenship is much, much bigger than that. The other kinds of things that you see in terms of civics and citizenship education is these really quite dry discussions about how preferential voting works, or how the two houses of parliament work, or who the keeper of the black rod in the Senate is. All this kind of stuff that is, interesting in a trivial kind of way. But again, I wouldn't call that citizenship. It's certainly not active citizenship. Instead, I think active citizenship needs to be more focused on getting young people involved, active, leading about issues that they think that are important in their local community. And fortunately, there are heaps of examples of this. And what I think we need to do as educators is provide ways to support that, to encourage that. So the school strike for climate, which has happened a couple of times, but I think 2019 in Sydney was one of the big ones, in Sydney at least. I think Melbourne was much, much bigger. Those are young people who are being active citizens because they see this as a crucial issue. I mean, those educators who supported them, I think, are doing it exactly right, because they are taking action, demanding change, forcing their politicians to have these conversations that they don't want to have. The leadership isn't coming from, federal parliament. In fact, federal parliament is having to be dragged to have these conversations. And I think that is the ideal of active citizenship. And of course, that's not an isolated incident. Young people, I think, are mobilising in much, much bigger numbers than ever before. We've got things like the Occupy movement, we've got Black Lives Matter, we've got Extinction Rebellion, all of these other kinds of social movements that are making fantastic use, and this is where my interest in technology comes in, fantastic use of social media and mobile technologies to do really exciting organising and activism. Yeah, so that's what we should be encouraging young people to do. That is active and informed members of the community.
Everything you just said was so insightful. Growing up when I was in primary school, we didn't get educated in any of those things. So it's really made me aware that I need to go educate myself in order to integrate it into my future classrooms. And before we end off the podcast today, we thought we would do a rapid fire round of questions. So, out of all the countries that you've taught in, which has been your favourite?
It'd have to be England. Yeah, I really enjoyed teaching in it. No, hang on. I want to change that answer. I did a little bit of teaching in Darmstadt in Germany, and it was wonderful. Mostly because we went to the pub after work every day.
What are your top 3 go-to classroom teaching tools?
Okay. I'm really enjoying Padlet at the moment. I'm doing a lot of playing around with Padlet. I mean, it's simple, it's easy, it's good, fun to use. I use Google Docs every single day, just because I like it. And Teams, I use Teams a lot.
What are you working on right now during lockdown?
I'm mostly teaching the graduate certificate in learning design, which is a pretty exciting course. If you're interested in becoming a learning designer, you should check it out. Sorry about the self-promotion there. And then I'm researching, well, actually, I'm putting together my second book, which is all about empowering teachers and democratizing schooling, which should be out with Springer in early 2022.
Oh, interesting. I'll definitely grab a copy when it comes out. And final question, what advice do you wish you had as a pre-service teacher before starting your career?
I think the advice that I wish I had was, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You don't have to do everything all at once. But just like a marathon, you do have to keep going. So when you graduate, you're not done learning. And you'll learn a lot in the first couple of years anyway, but you need to actively take a bit of control over your own career and seek out opportunities to do short courses, micro-credentials, professional development, master's degrees, PhDs, whatever the case may be, but you've got to look for those opportunities. And when you apply for opportunities, you won't get them all. You'll get knocked back on some of them. Rejection is a part of life. It's a big part of academic life. But don't let that get you down, dust yourself off and go for the next one.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Your wisdom and outlook on learning design and technology in education really shone a light on how us pre-service teachers can implement these skills into our own teaching practice. And everything you said just came across so passionately, and we are so grateful that you were able to speak with us today, and that we're able to share all your advice with our members and the people listening to this podcast. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I think teachers are the heroes. What's the saying from Korea? Teachers are nation builders. That's what you all are. Yeah.
Wow, that's very powerful. Thank you so much for listening to our Pre-Service Teacher Pals podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this podcast with all your teaching pals. Let us know if you have any questions, and be sure to follow us on our Instagram, UTS EdSoc. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next podcast.